as I spent more and more time with these people and realized that they have just as vivid lives as I do, as you do, that they have vital spiritual energy, and they love and want to be loved. They know and they want to be known. And it may be in different ways, in ways that are a bit foreign to us. But that essential self that we would say made in the image of God is very present. Mm-hmm. But we often see what we want to see. And if we've decided out of hand that someone has disappeared, then we're going to focus on those parts that are lost, mm-hmm. as opposed to the parts that are still there. So
welcome to Great Bible Teacher Interviews. Hello, I'm Rick Jordan, President of Great Bible Teachers. Each week, I have the opportunity to interview a scholar, an author, or a practitioner. We talk about the Bible, or biblical interpretation, or spiritual formation. Today, I'm very happy to present to you the interview that I had with Lynn Harper. Lynn is a writer and a minister and a chaplain. She's the author of a new book called On Vanishing: Mortality, Dementia, and What It Means to Disappear. It was published by Catapult in April of 2020. It's a nonfiction work. It explores the dimensions of spirituality and social justice and dementia. Lynn received a Barbara Deming Fund grant for women writers for this project. Her work has appeared in Kenyon Review Online, Catapult, the Huffington Post, North American Review, the Journal of Religion and Abuse, and elsewhere. She received the New Delta Review Nonfiction Prize in 2013 and the Orison Anthology's 2017 Nonfiction Award. She's an ordained Baptist pastor. She completed her Master of Divinity degree at Wake Forest University Divinity School. Lynn served for 7 years as the nursing home chaplain at a continuing care retirement community on the North Jersey Shore. She currently serves as the minister of older adults at Riverside Church in the city of New York. During this pandemic, she is doing that from Maine, where she lives with her husband, Ryan, and he is a college professor there. I got to know Lynn about 15 years ago when she and Ryan were going to graduate school and were members of our church and became members of my Bible study group. So it's been great to see her advance in her career, and now with this publication of this book, the way she can have a broader ministry as well. So I hope you'll enjoy this interview that I had with Lynn Harper. Lynn, thank you so much for being with us today on Great Bible Teachers Interviews. As I've said in the preface, and that you and I have known each other a good long time, or we knew each other a long time ago, and you've now written this book, and we're going to talk about that. I would like for you to share with us first, though, about your own personal spiritual journey and who has been a great Bible teacher in your life that has helped shape who you are.
Thanks, Rick, for having me. And thanks for that question. I just think sort of in this sense of a communion of saints, I've had such good Bible teachers, you being one of them at Ardmore. And before Ardmore, in my undergraduate experience, I encountered a wonderful Bible teacher named Andy Pratt. And Andy introduced me to this idea that a Bible study could be both devotional and have academic heft. And the context and knowing the context doesn't take away from our devotion, but actually strengthens it. Mm-hmm. And so I can remember very profoundly my senior year at Southeast Missouri State, and I had Old Testament with Dr. Pratt. And the morning of 9/11, I was walking to Old Testament when I heard the news. And it was just so devastating. And walking into Old Testament, having Dr. Pratt there was just such a comfort And we didn't do a lesson that day. I think he offered a blessing and sent us home. But the rest of that semester, we had that lens of, we're going to come and we're going to grapple with this ancient text, having just as a nation experienced this most traumatic event. And he brought the text to life in such a rich and powerful way. I remember Job. He took us through Job, and we talked about suffering that doesn't have a reason. And that had never occurred to me, as a person of faith, like everything has a reason and God ordains, or, what if God doesn't ordain suffering? And so we really grappled that semester, and I'm just so grateful the way head and heart are just such a seamless thread for him. And so I wanted to mention Dr. Pratt, and then I have to mention Phyllis Tribble and Diane Lipset in Wake Divinity School, who I just had the privilege of Old Testament and New Testament with these two powerhouse feminist scholars. And Dr. Tribble, I always just had this image of Jacob wrestling the angels. Like, she was going to wrestle down the text until it blessed her. So, she would just take one word or one phrase in the Hebrew and just work on it with us in class until it was going to bless us. And so I learned from her, you go deep, and you don't be afraid to wrestle, and don't be afraid to ask the discomforting questions. And Diane Lipset is the same way in her own kind of approach. I wouldn't say she was quite the fierce wrestler. She was more of the pastor, fiercely and robustly, going after the text, but helping us as future pastors. How do we bring academic heft to the pulpit, to our Bible studies? And so I can remember her going through the 7 cudgel texts related to homosexuality. And she went through those texts that are often used to shame people or exclude people. And she just systematically went through each of the texts, gave us context, gave us history, helped us understand how these fit into a greater framework, and then let us come to some of our own conclusions. And she did so in such an incisive and gentle way. And I just thank her for that. So I could go on, but I do want to list one more person who's really important. Her name is Betty. That's what I call her in the book. I've changed her name. Betty is a woman I met on the dementia unit when I was a chaplain there. And I often felt, I would see Betty. I knew she was an evangelical, which was rare in the facility I was working in. It was mostly Roman Catholic, Jewish, and mainline Protestants. And she always had her Bible. And she would wheel up and down the unit with her well-worn Bible, highlights and all. And I wondered, how do I reach her? So I asked Betty one day, would you, because I know, being a former evangelical myself, nothing is better than a Bible study. And now too, but I said, Betty, would you like to start a Bible study? And she said, yes. And so we were co-teachers, and she would invite her neighbors, and we would meet in the dining room after lunch and have our very unconventional Bible study. Everyone had some degree of dementia, many very severe. And so Betty taught me how to go with the flow and not need to control the study, but let it be what it is. And so we would read Genesis on Thursday afternoons in the dining room. So we just started at the beginning and would read stories from Genesis. And I remember reading the one where Joseph's brothers throw him in the pit. And I read the story, and then we have a question for discussion, or however people want to enter in. Silence, nothing. Maybe 1 or 2 people said something, but Betty wasn't speaking and her eyes were closed. And so I thought, well, maybe Betty doesn't want to really engage today. So I'll offer the closing prayer. And after we prayed, she just goes, "Oh, the jealousy." And so she responded to the text so right on, so spot on in her own time. It took time. And I think that's what she taught me is slow down, allow for silence, and it will come. And so I always think of Betty too as helping me embrace silence in a Bible study.
Yeah. Wow. That's pretty a neat story. And you've got some neat characters there, very high academic kind of characters. And then another character who is an ordinary person but who has taught you how to teach better as well. Tell us a little bit about your path to where you are now. That, as I say, you and I knew each other in Winston-Salem. We went to the same church, and you were in school, and then you left us and grew up and became a professional minister. And so tell us a little bit about your path and where you are now.
Well, sure, absolutely. So much goes back to Winston-Salem and getting to experience wonderful Bible teachers in that area. I was ordained by Grace Baptist Church in Statesville. Lovely. I call them my funky little Baptist church, and they're completely mission driven and loving. And so after I was ordained there, my husband Ryan and I moved up to Princeton, New Jersey, where he began his PhD in American religious history. And I started a CPE residency at a hospital in New Jersey, and thinking this is a good transitional year. I'll get some CPE experience. And then I wasn't tied to staying in healthcare or hospital or wherever. I just thought this is a good experience, and then I'll see where it takes me. In that time of CPE, that year-long residency, and I guess for those who don't know CPE, it's clinical pastoral education, chaplaincy training. In that year, I found myself being assigned to these places where I encountered people with cognitive difficulty, to a neurological unit where people were post-op from strokes and brain bleeds. And so I was encountering people for whom words and having an exchange like we're having was very difficult. So again, I was having to learn the value of silence, the value of body language, of presence without a lot of rational exchange. After my year long in the hospital, I was hired as a chaplain at a retirement community out on the New Jersey shore with 1,400 residents, a large non-sectarian community. And I was the chaplain in the most, I guess, the facility side that wasn't independent living. So assisted living, skilled nursing, where people needed the most help. And so I was assigned to the 200 residents there. And I worked there for about 7 years. And that really ignited my passion around working with persons with dementia and their families and caregivers. And so we can return to that. But after that, I spent some time, I knew I wanted to write about my experiences there. So I had a little bit of a gap time while my husband was doing a visiting position where I did some writing. I had a grant to do some writing about it. And then from there, ended up in New York City at the Riverside Church. My husband at NYU, and I was hired as the minister of older adults at Riverside, which it's an interdenominational church, interracial, international, and it's been 4 years now. So yeah, it's been quite an incredible journey that keeps putting me in the path of elders, of older adults. And I wouldn't have necessarily been on that trajectory, even though I spent a year interning at a retirement community in Winston-Salem, and I enjoyed it, but I didn't think this is my passion and this is my life. But the more I came in contact with older adults, the more I just realized this is a group of people who are often marginalized in society. We talk about, people being at their prime and then, kind of receding off into the sunset of retirement. And instead, I found just a wealth of gifts that were ready to be given, but needed receivers,
Mm-hmm.
and great complexity, and a lot of seasoned saints ready to help and be a part of life, and whether or not they had cognitive difficulty.
Mm-hmm.
So
One of the things, well, let's talk about your book. Your book, I guess, tell us about how you came to do that.
So on my first day at the retirement community in New Jersey, I was given a tour by an administrator of the 5 floors of the facility. And the 4th floor was the dementia unit. And I remember very clearly when we were given the tour, and we stopped at the program room, and there was some event going on. And, at the time I didn't know anyone's name. I didn't really know. I never worked day in and day out on this kind of unit. And I remember the administrator saying to me, either directly or indirectly, "You won't be spending much time here." And the subtle or not so subtle message was, these people won't remember you the minute you leave. It's best to go ahead and go to those people who will remember and, quote, appreciate your visit. There's 200 people. You only have so much time. And so I received a message that day that's pretty consistent with our culture, a culture that is pretty dismissive of people who think differently, that they're somehow vanishing or they're disappearing to themselves. And so we're sort of expected to disappear from them, to not give them our best energy or our best time.
Mm-hmm.
And pastors have also been honest with me that those people often fall to the bottom of their to visit lists.
Mm-hmm.
And family members often corroborate that in a sense and say, don't worry about visiting mom. She won't remember you.
Mm-hmm.
And so I mentioned that administrator not to say that he was some sort of monster, because he wasn't. It just was deeply reflective of our values. So when my spiritual antenna is working correctly, and it's not always, but when it is, I have to ask the question, why? Why are people being left out? Why do we receive these messages that some people are worthy of our time and other people aren't?
Mm-hmm.
And so that question kept coming to me over the years as I spent more and more time with these people, and realized that they have just as vivid lives as I do, as you do, that they have vital spiritual energy, and they love and want to be loved. They know and they want to be known. And it may be in different ways, in ways that are a bit foreign to us. But that essential self that we would say made in the image of God is very present.
Mm-hmm.
But we often see what we want to see. And if we've decided out of hand that someone has disappeared, then we're going to focus on those parts that are lost.
Mm-hmm.
As opposed to the parts that are still there. So I guess that's where the book came from, that passion of wrestling with these questions over the years about why are these people dismissed, and what does that say about me? What does that say about a dominant culture that somehow says that's okay?
Mm-hmm.
And as a Christian, it's not okay.
Yeah, yeah. I wonder if part of it, I've been reading your book and then living my life. And so, it's like these things are intertwining. I don't know if like there are 4 generations of us that live in my household. We have my wife and myself. My wife's parents live with us, who are in their late 80s, early 90s. And then one of my sons and his wife, and then their son. And so just recently I was looking at him, who is 4 months old this week. And so, and I was thinking, he doesn't really have anything to offer us as far as he can't communicate. He doesn't have interesting stories. And yet we can't take our eyes off of him. And, it's just, there's just a lot of attention and love that is given. So what's the difference between, a 4-month-old who doesn't have anything to offer and someone with Alzheimer's who are much older, a lot more experienced, they can communicate maybe some, but, why is there this discontinuity between how we treat one person on one end of life and one person on the other end of life?
Right, that's a great question. Because no one has to remind you or your family that little 4-month-old is a person.
Right.
But we often have to, on the other end of life, remind people that these are full persons who deserve the same rights and respect as any other person.
Mm-hmm.
And so why is that that disconnect? And one theory I have is that we assume that a 4-month-old will grow and develop in such a way that one day they will have interesting stories to tell us, and they will have a robust life, and quite frankly, will contribute to the economy.
Mm-hmm.
If we want to kind of take a little bit of a cynical view, that culturally we really value a certain kind of productivity, and so we see this potential in this person. We don't say that out loud, but it's kind of deep within us.
Mm-hmm.
And then on the other end of life, we don't see that quote potential. And so it's harder to afford personhood in that way.
Mm-hmm.
And I think as people of faith, that's our challenge is personhood is a constant throughout the lifespan.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't ebb or flow based on ability, based on economic power or intellectual prowess, where you're born or where you end up.
Mm-hmm.
That personhood is deeply rooted in God's creation of us,
Mm-hmm.
which we see in the Bible, which we can pull on from the Bible,
Mm-hmm.
but it's countercultural.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's countercultural was a big thing, isn't it? Like our dominant culture, if you will, is what can you do for us as a society? And if there's well, you can't really do anything for us in the end of life spectrum part anyway, then we aren't going to ask the chaplain to spend too much time with you, for example. Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
So,
Or we're as a church, we're not going to put a lot of resources into older adult ministry, while we'll pump a lot of resources into youth and children. And I'm not saying it should be either or, but it's something we have to look at as a system, is how churches operate.
mm-hmm.
We know that we live in an aging society.
Mm-hmm.
We can look at that, we can lament, and there's a lot of lamentation about that in churches, the graying of churches, the blue hairs in the congregation. So we can lament it, or we can embrace it and see it as a mission field and as a ministry opportunity, and not just to entertain old people. Like we have a cruise ship mentality, like, oh, they just want to play bingo and go on bus trips. No, like, how do we harvest the decades of faith,
Mm-hmm.
the decades of learning and growing, and see that as the church's strength as opposed to a liability?
Right, right. So is in your book, you kind of point out too that this doesn't have to be, that hasn't always been. And one of the stories I remember is of Emerson and the essayist and a brilliant mind and person, and who was later in his later life not able to do the writing and the great thinking and communicating. But maybe you could flesh that out a little bit more about him and how people reacted to him at the end of his life.
Yeah, Ralph Waldo Emerson, such a beautiful case of how, like you say, Rick, it hasn't always been like this. It hasn't always been that we associate older age with diminishment or with sort of discard and we don't want to see you anymore. So Emerson was in 19th century, I believe he died in 1882. I have to check on that, but later in the 19th century. And toward the end of his life, and we know him as, like you say, a brilliant philosopher, essayist, lecturer, probably in the last decade of his life, he has what we probably now diagnose as something like Alzheimer's disease or some other form of dementia. But at the time, they didn't have those kind of diagnostic labels. And he knew that he was having trouble finding words. It wasn't a secret. Those around him knew that he was having trouble thinking and that he was forgetting. And so it wasn't this sort of shameful secret that people tried to hide. And he wasn't hidden away. He continued to lecture. And so there's this beautiful scene of him lecturing and his daughter Ellen going with him. And she would mouth the words to the lecture to kind of help him. And so she provided that assistance and he was able to continue on. So we see less stigma.
Mm-hmm.
And if we just look at this snapshot of his later life, and it wasn't that there wasn't sadness or lamentation around his deficits, but it didn't wholly define him. And so people would come to be with him and just sit in his presence. Walt Whitman would come and journey and talked about just sitting, getting to be in his presence was enough. And they didn't have to have this deep philosophical exchange. So it's a really beautiful alternate picture from how we often approach the aging journey, cognitive diminishment as this sort of horror show that, everyone back away and, keep the person inside. But that there was a sort of acceptance and a little bit of a tender and a softer way of approaching aging and some of the losses.
Mm-hmm.
But then in the 20th century, for many really great advancements in medicine and biomedical technology that have helped save so many lives, and we're so grateful. The other side of that is there was a rise in using a lot of diagnostic labels. So Alzheimer's disease was identified in early 20th century. And in some ways that's really great. In other ways, these diagnostic categories can sometimes pigeonhole people. So it's not just one part of who you are, but it somehow becomes the whole picture of who you are. Mm-hmm. So when we say Alzheimer's victim, so-and-so's an Alzheimer's victim, instead of a person living with Alzheimer's disease. It's a subtle difference, but it's a big difference. An Alzheimer's victim, it sounds like that person is totally their disease. Whereas if we start thinking a little differently and they're a person living with Alzheimer's. So it's the blessing and curses of advancement is we have to figure out how to navigate it in ways that are empathetic and compassionate.
Or we also have the option these days of saying, well, I think I'll just end it all. I think, and you have a really, I think, interesting perspective. I can't remember the name of the lady who decided that she would end her life, and then your perspective on it is that what she was ending was her future life, like this other person who she was going to become, and that she didn't want to become that person, and so she ended her life. So we have a growing acceptance, I think, of that option.
Yeah, in the course of writing my book, when I would share with people what I'm writing about, dementia, and I began to get very accustomed to people telling me they wanted to end their lives if they had dementia. Some people in jest, they would kind of joke, well, I'd like to take a long walk off a short pier if I ever have dementia. Or I can recall a man at a bus stop who was just a stranger, and we were chatting, and he said, well, if I ever get diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease, I'm going to go to the gun shop, my first stop. So I began to kind of log those things because I thought it was very telling. And I think it tells us a lot about the fear of cognitive loss, which is real. I mean, I feel that. There's a fear of loss of control. But we have to question, why this condition?
Mm-hmm.
So if I said I'm writing on terminal heart disease, I doubt someone would tell me, well, I'm going to go to the gun shop the minute I get a terminal diagnosis in that vein. So what is it about dementia and the diseases that causes to go to this really fearful place? And what can we do with that fear? So as people of faith, we have a lot of resources for that in our scripture. How many times Jesus says, fear not, I am with you. I am with you always. So I hesitate to, correct people. I don't, that's, and in some people that will be their choice. But I think it's worthy of our reflection why it's so fearful, and what about our treatment of people makes it so. So that it's not just inherently fearful, even though there's aspects of it that are. But what is it in the way, if you think that if you have this diagnosis, you will lose friends and your church won't, you can't come to church anymore and you can't be a part of a group, that's pretty fearful, the isolation. And we know from research that people, when they have a diagnosis of dementia, when they share that with others, a third of them report losing friends. So, that's a reality I think the church has to grapple with.
And part of it is, I guess, that we think, well, if I lose some other part of my body, it's not my personality necessarily, I guess. But if I lose my mind, then, the Bible does have things that implicitly or explicitly kind of say that you're more than your brain, right? I mean, so we're an integrated person of mind and body and soul and spirit and our personality, our character, all of these things. But there is something about, but if I lose my brain, then, people have, like, I'm a vegetable. I'm not a person anymore.
Yeah, it's certainly not to diminish some ways very natural fears of what happens when there's cognitive change. I think the idea that people become vegetables is often a stereotype and is not the case, that there's a wide variance in how people experience dementia. And that for some people, the changes aren't always negative. I have a friend who has dementia, and she says, my old self is gone. Yes, and I lament that. But the new person that's arrived, I like her. Yeah. And some of the stressors and anxieties and things that I used to carry, I don't anymore, and so I think there's just a wide variance to move away from the idea that we become sort of vegetables, but that, yes, we do need supports, just like any other disability. So if someone had a bum knee and used a cane, we wouldn't look less of them. We would say, okay, they're doing what they need. Well, people need that for memory too. They need memory ramps if they can't go up memory steps, memory elevators instead of steps. So, how do we support people in the changes the same way we would support people with a bum knee or a bum shoulder? That we become places that are accessible, not only for physical handicaps, but for cognitive handicaps as well. So I think there's that piece, and there is the deeper piece of what makes us whole. And, if we're made in the image of God, if we have trouble thinking, that image doesn't change or vanish. It abides. And John Swinton, who wrote this beautiful book about dementia and theology, he says we live in the memories of God, and that we're held in God's memory, which is much vaster than any one person's ability to remember everything. And that as the community, as a church, we hold people's memories too. And so someday I can't remember being in your class, Rick, at Ardmore. Maybe others will, and they'll tell that story. And I think that's what we do in faith communities. So when Miss Mabel can't remember her famous strawberry pies, we tell about it, and we tell her about that and how much we love it. So we become that extension of memory when someone can't hold it all for themselves, in the same way that God is an extension of such a grander memory, and that nothing is lost in that sense. And to me, that's profoundly comforting, even if I don't understand how that works exactly.
Yeah, right. So this in your book, you also talk about, this was one of the most jarring things for me, was that you, I want to read a quote that you have in your book. Near the end, you talk about your own self. Well, you talk about yourself threaded through the book, and the possibility of dementia in your own life. But then by the end of the book, you're saying, I declare my will to live with dementia as an act of protest against the dominant culture that wishes not to be troubled by my presence. And you talk about adding the phrase to your vocabulary, when I get dementia, instead of if I get dementia. And so I'm curious about how that came about, like that shift in your own mindset and what that shift has done for you.
So I first learned about that kind of linguistic shift from, if I get dementia to when I have dementia, from a nursing home administrator who said she used it because it reflected some of her chances, but it also helped to kind of close the distance between them and us. And I thought, well, what a powerful testimony. And so I tried it out myself. saying when I have dementia, you feel a little catch in your throat, like, oh, that's hard to say.
Mm.
And I want to be clear when I use that turn of phrase, it's not saying I want to have it or that it's inevitable that everyone who grows older will have dementia. That's not the case. And there's a lot of research about preventing dementia and things we can do.
Mm.
So it's not inviting a condition, but it's saying that this is part of what's on the spectrum of being human,
Mhm.
that this is part of what might be part of my journey. It's very much strong in my family history. Both of my parents carry a genetic variant and they've given me permission to share that makes them at increased risk for late onset dementia. So the chances are that I probably have that variant as well. And so for me, it helps to reduce the fear
Mm.
if I can name it as something that may be a part of my life. For other people, it may not reduce fear. For one woman, I shared it and that was not for her. She let me know about it. And then for another woman at that same workshop, she said, "Thank you. That just took all the fear away from me."
Mm.
But it is a kind of a bold move and not for everyone.
Yeah.
But I
Yeah.
think what often happens is we push this disease or this set of diseases off the spectrum of humanity,
Mhm.
as if this is what makes you vanish as a person.
Mm.
And when I say when I have dementia, I'm saying no, I'm not going to vanish. You're not going to vanish. This is going to be something very human,
Mhm.
so human um, that we're going to stay present to it
Mhm.
even now.
Um, you have another quote I want to read back to you. Don't you love when people read your quotes to you? Um, the social response to dementia creates as much suffering as the disease itself. And that's talking about society at large. But if I want to narrow the context down to church society, and I mean, could we say that of the church as well? That the church's response to dementia is sometimes worse than the dementia itself for the person if they have felt banished.
Mm. Well, it's certainly worthy of our reflection. I can't speak to every faith community and how they've responded. I know some faith communities have responded by having alternate worship services, dementia-friendly worship services.
Oh.
Um, I know that some congregations do a wonderful job of supporting caregivers. So I don't want to paint with a really broad brush, but I would say that in my experience, for the most part, it's not typically talked about in churches. Dementia and Alzheimer's. Alzheimer's is the most common form of dementia. It's not really spoken about in prayers and pastoral prayers or in sermons. And if it is spoken about categorically negatively. So
Mm.
I remember being in a sermon, and the pastor, a rather large church, said the worst thing that can happen to a person, the worst thing we can even imagine, is having Alzheimer's disease.
Mm.
And I thought, well, what about the people in your congregation who have that diagnosis?
Yeah.
That doesn't make for a very, oh, I'd love to share this with my Bible study group.
Yeah. Right.
Hey, I have the worst thing that could ever happen to a person happen to me, and so our language matters. How we talk about these conditions, we don't dismiss the suffering, but we don't say it has to be all suffering.
Mm-hmm.
And no matter the case, we're going to be here for you. And we're not going to run away from these discussions. So I think the more the church can not contribute to the conspiracy of stigma by not talking about it. So let's talk about it. let's hear from people who have a diagnosis. Let's hear from their caregivers, and try to create an atmosphere in which you're welcomed. And actually, we need you. We need your gifts. And for me, encountering people with dementia and ministering to them has been the greatest grace in my life.
Mm.
Has made me in some ways whole. And so I'm so grateful for the ministry of those who are experiencing cognitive challenge. And so I think the church.
Yeah, say some more about that. Like what are the gifts we can receive from people who seem to have less and less to give?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think for one, and going back to Betty and our Bible study group on the fourth floor, which ended up evolving after her death into kind of an interfaith spirituality group. I learned from that group, silence does not mean something's wrong, that no one's in trouble or no one's angry, that silence can be a very holy space, waiting for the spirit to move and for people to have a chance to express. So coming to a greater comfort level with silence would be one of the greatest gifts I've received. Taking myself maybe a little less seriously. And I'm someone who, I'm a planner. I like to plan, and I like to make sure that things run a certain way, and to let go of some of the need for control, which is a constant, everyday challenge. But if I can learn through my encounters with people for whom control is no longer on the table, but life still goes on in these rich and sometimes surprisingly beautiful ways, then that allows me to learn trust, which is at the heart of our faith. So I could go on, but I think that learning to trust and to not have to control everything, and that doesn't mean I won't be loved.
Mm-hmm.
If I don't have it all together, that doesn't mean I don't have to earn love.
Mm-hmm.
The love and grace is still there. I think it was Kate Swaffer, she has dementia, was asked that question. What does it feel like to die? What does it feel like for you to know you're going to die?
Yeah.
And churches are the perfect places. Small group Bible studies are the perfect intimate places to get to talk about the ultimate taboo, death and dying. And not just in older adult Bible studies, but young adult Bible studies, that we don't have to be allergic to that, because the Bible talks about it all the time. For Christians, our central figure, his death is at the center of that. So it's on our tongues, it's in our hymns, it's everywhere.
Yeah.
So we have, in some ways, a great tool that others don't. It's right there in the Bible to talk about.
Yeah, and the litany, as you've already mentioned, throughout the scripture of fear not. And just reflecting back on the story you just told about the pastor who's like, this is the worst thing that could happen to you. You know, it'd be interesting to have a one-on-one conversation with that pastor and say, why would it be the worst? And the reason is because you're afraid. You're afraid of what you're going to lose. And so it could be a challenging spiritual discussion to say, what are we afraid of? What have we seen others lose? And what are we afraid of losing? And does God walk with us through our losing? Or is it always just have to be a win-win-win to be a real faith?
Yeah, and talk about countercultural.
Mm-hmm.
To be able to have these safe spaces where we can talk about what we're afraid of
Mhm.
and talk about what we've lost in life and the ways we've dealt with that through faith, and that it doesn't have to always be a triumph. And that's so countercultural in a culture where you're building your resume or you're projecting an image of having it together.
Mhm.
And if this time of COVID-19 has taught us anything, it's that we don't have it all together.
Well, Lynn, is there anything that I didn't ask you that I should have asked? Is there something you really want to share this bit of knowledge or wisdom, or any last word for the Bible study teacher?
Oh, that's great. That's great, Rick. I guess I'd like to mention one more Bible study great teacher or teachers.
Uh-huh.
Every Thursday, I uh, have a Bible study with the older adults at the Riverside Church, and we've transitioned to Zoom, and it's primarily older Black women. And for me to do readings with them has just like shed so many blinders, so many like white assumptions about the scripture. And I think it's so important that we place ourselves, especially those of us who have some kind of like cultural power by birth, um, to place ourselves in reading communities where we can learn from those who have not had those experiences, and to be listeners, not coming with the answers, but to really listen. And so this group, just a few weeks ago, we were looking at the great wedding banquet and Mark, that parable. And at the end of the banquet, it's such a jarring parable where the person who isn't dressed correctly for the wedding is tossed out, like bound into the outer darkness. And the passion with which this group read this, like no one should be put out because they can't afford the correct clothing. And one woman said, I would have gone out with him. They would have had to bound me out to cast me out with him. It was just this completely other reading that they were seeing. We would join in solidarity with this person who was cast out. And so I think, yeah, I would just say the more we can place ourselves, those of us with a measure of power, to read alongside people who the Bible has often been used against them and against their dignity. And yet they've switched it and said, no, we will not take the scripture as one that will bind me, but will liberate me.
I want to thank Lynn Harper for her insights and the way she shared them with us during this interview. If you would like to learn more about the Bible and how the Bible relates to different things such as dementia or depression or other things that happen in our lives, then I encourage you to sign up for the greatbibleteachers.com e-news. You can go to greatbibleteachers.com and sign up there. On the right-hand side of the page, there's a place you can sign up. You'll get an email on Tuesdays letting you know about a blog that is coming out that week, and on Thursdays to let you know about the interview that we'll be doing that week. So I hope you'll sign up, that you'll join us, and that you'll learn and share with us.